Bertrand Russell's The Problems of Philosophy, Part 4. So we turn to chapter 9 at this point, which is called The World of Universals. And Russell really makes a hero of Plato out of this section, discussing his theory of the forms. He praises, he applauds Plato's views as the most successful attempt to solve this problem of universals. Of course, we've already discussed Plato's theory in the ancient philosophy lectures, and we've seen the problems that this theory has. So we won't need to go into that again. You can review those on your own if you wish to. But using Plato as his base, Russell makes the statement that every statement is going to contain at least one universal within it. So if we take, for example, the statement, Charles I's head was cut off, Russell admits that these words lead us to a particular image of the act of chopping off a head, specifically the head of Charles I. But he insists that that head is a universal term. Cut is also a universal term. And so in order to properly understand what is going on when we make the statement Charles I's head was cut off, even though it's a specific event that took place in 1649, one person, one head, right, one chop of the axe. The fact is, he says, that if we really want to understand what's happening in those words, in that sentence, we need to be able to look at what's being said from the standpoint of a universal, because the concept of a head, in his words, is a universal concept. It doesn't apply just to Charles I. That's one example of it, but head could imply your head, my head, anyone's head. It's a universal concept. It's an idea in the mind. And so when we say the word head, that word head is going to conjure up an image of a thing with ears and eyes and nose and mouth and so on. And the likelihood is that we'll probably get a particular image in our mind of that, but we can abstract away that and understand the concept of head in a universal fashion. Likewise, he says, with the word cut, we would see the same thing. I mean, this is one particular instance of that axe falling and the head coming off. So that sense of cut is specific in this moment. But when we say the word cut, we're going to get our own perspective, our own image of what that action is going to look like. So for him, these terms like head and cut are universals. Russell acknowledges that some people are going to try to deny the existence of universals. Empiricists such as Berkeley and Hume are going to deny the existence of abstract ideas. When they want to conjure the image of whiteness, for example, they'll think of a particular white thing. So if I want to imagine whiteness, then I'm going to think of a white fence that I've recently seen. Or maybe I'll think of a white piece of paper, right? I mean, if I'm looking at whiteness, right, there it is. There's whiteness right there, this sheet of paper. There's whiteness right there with regards to that fence. I'm thinking of a particular entity that I've seen or that I know of that is white. But Russell's saying here that essentially to get to the image of whiteness, I must think of some particular thing in the world that has the attribute of being white. Now, Russell believes that this is troublesome because if we use the term white to apply to a white fence, for example, we would need to relate it to something that we know to be white. So the relation that he's talking about here is in and of itself a universal. In the text, he says, since there are many white things, the resemblance must hold between many pairs of particular white things. And this is the characteristic of a universal. It will be useless to say that there is a different resemblance for each pair, for then we shall have to say that these resemblances resemble each other, and thus at last we shall be forced to admit resemblance as a universal. The relation of resemblance, therefore, must be a true universal. And having been forced to admit this universal, we find that it is no longer worthwhile to invent difficult and unplausible theories to avoid the admission of such universals as whiteness and triangularity. So Russell is basically arguing that the empiricists have failed to respond to this issue. They only think about qualities and not of relations as being universals. So we think of, the idea of whiteness being a universal, but we don't think about the fact that there is a relationship between the concept of white and the concept of fence, between the concept of white and the concept of paper. Having said this, then he goes on to very infuriatingly, in my opinion, make the declaration, having now seen that there must be such entities as universals, the next point to be proved is that their being is not merely mental. You see what I said at the beginning about making a hero of Plato's perspective? Trying to claim that this universal is not just a linguistic or a mental concept, but that it is something that has a reality of its own. And I don't see the proof that Russell is talking about here. He seems to be sort of jumping the gun with regards to this, maybe even committing a little bit of a begging the question fallacy, because he's claiming to have accepted the thing that he should be trying to prove to me. And he has not proven to me that a relation is a universal. He hasn't proven to me or other empiricists that the truth itself is universal. So Russell hasn't proven that a relation is universal. Relations are imposed by society. Relations are linguistically based. In fact, we could resolve a lot of the problems that Russell is dealing with here if we look to the work of the American philosopher Wilfrid Sellars. Wilfrid Sellars developed a notion called psychological nominalism, which I think makes a tremendous amount of sense. It basically says that all of our knowledge is linguistic. If we recognize that all of our knowledge, everything that we know only because of language, then we recognize that language is something that has been developed by us, by human beings, because we are social creatures, because we have a desire to communicate. And so, long ago, somebody decided that things that had a hard, flat surface, that were elevated off the ground by legs, we're going to give them the title table. And so we've created that word. That word gets used until it becomes incorporated within our ordinary speech pattern, into the language game that we are playing. And anyone who is raised within this same specific language game will be able to make use of those terms. Now, like the anti-realists of the Middle Ages would tell us, the fact is that these things that we're using, they seem like universal concepts, and they are in the sense that they are mental. So I can say table, I can say hardness, I can say leg, and things of that nature, and have other people who speak my language understand what I'm talking about. These things will conjure an image in their mind so that we can communicate. But that doesn't mean that the form of whiteness, tableness, chair, whatever is real. It doesn't mean that those things exist. And when it comes to the idea of relations, that too, it's not the case that white is related to the paper. White is simply a term, a concept in the mind that's predicated of this piece of paper. So we use universal terms because it's easier to communicate. If I had to, depict every table or every piece of paper or every instance of whiteness by a different name, we'd never be able to communicate with each other. So we developed language as a way of doing that. But these words are, like Rosalind said, just flatum vocus. They're puffs of air that spew from us. And there's no substance behind them. So our understanding of the world comes through language. Our knowledge comes through language. Reality, truth, is all revealed through language. And language is a social construct. Language is a man-made thing. And so I think that if we were to apply this idea of psychological nominalism, we could put this whole ugly business that Russell's talking about to rest. But of course, Russell is not interested in doing that because he is so arrogantly sure of his perspective, of his opinion, that he doesn't want to even properly, fully argue it. He just wants to assume it. We can see Russell's erroneous thinking in his look at the statement, Edinburgh is north of London. Now, in understanding this statement, Russell says that we need to understand Edinburgh and London, yes, but also that one is north of the other, which is a directional relation. He says that this is a fact, regardless of our understanding or our knowing it. In other words, even if there were no intelligent life forms on this planet, it would still be a fact that Edinburgh is north of London. It's not dependent on the mind of anyone whatsoever. It is, again, a simple matter, as you can see from the map there, that we have Edinburgh right up here, and we have London down here. So clearly, if London's to the south, Edinburgh is to the north. Simple as that. But Russell is missing the key point here. Edinburgh and London are put on the map, built by human hands in a particular spot on the globe, and they're drawn by human hands on the map. Humans, through language, decided to designate their own directions, north, south, east, west. There's nothing inherent or absolute about any of these things. They are purely a linguistic construct. I understand that Edinburgh is north of London only because I play a particular language game in which we've created sounds to represent particular ideas in my mind. Not universal Platonic ideas or forms or universals or any of that other flatum vocus, but rather mental notions conjured up in language for the purpose of communication. Despite this, Russell holds very firmly to his belief, and he embraces universals in the language of Plato. The world of universals is the world of being. It's unchangeable, it's right, it's exact. It seems that through Russell, Plato is going to be reborn, and along with it, philosophical progress is going to fly backwards 2,500 years. So Russell insists that these ideas of relation imply that universals are real, that universals have reality. But I don't think that he understands any more than Plato did, that before we can have any of this type of talk, we first have to have language. Let's go ahead and move on to chapter 10, our knowledge of universals. So, having asserted his firm belief in universals, Russell says that we have acquaintance with relations between universals. So we take a piece of white paper, like you see on the screen there. Some parts of the paper are at the top, some at the bottom, some to the left, some to the right, some in the middle. Now we abstract such concepts as to the left from acquaintance with our experience. Of course, these relations, as I pointed out earlier, really have no meaning outside of language. But again, Russell misses that point. But anyway, we are going to use these terms, and we come to them through the idea of acquaintance. So if I say the top of the page, you're going to consider what is the top of the page. Now, of course, this is in and of itself is difficult for the simple reason that the piece of white paper that we're looking at, it has no writing, it has no distinguishing features. And so isn't the top of the page itself a relative term? In the drawing here, we see that this would probably be considered the top of the page simply because of the orientation of the way that it's positioned. But it could be that this particular piece of paper is upside down and that's the top. Maybe if we chose to write on it or draw on it in a landscape form, that would be the top, or that would be the top. We could also argue that in the way that it's laying, this whole surface is the top because the flip side would be the bottom. So these relations themselves, they exist within language, and they are very relative and very subjective. But again, Russell misses all of this. According to Russell, a priori knowledge, and that's what kind of got us into this discussion in the first place several chapters back, a priori knowledge deals only with relationships of universals. And so he uses as an example here, he says, any collection of twos is a collection of four. So once we understand the words two, four, and collection, then there's no need for any reference to a particular. But of course, again, this implies using language which was developed in relation to particulars. Again, we see the example on the screen. We have two markers here. We have two erasers over here. And so here's a collection of two. Here's a collection of two. We put them together. There's a collection of four that's being presented. And I come to understand that only because of the particulars that are there. I mean, when we're teaching young children mathematics for the first time, this is the way we're doing it. We're showing you pictures of things, right? How many are there? 1, 2. How many are there? 1, 2, right? And put them together now. 1, 2, 3, 4. We learn these concepts within the context of language by using particular forms to do so. Now later, yes, we can sort of abstract away and we can use other symbols such as the number 2, the number 4, which again are man-made symbols, but they're still symbolizing the basic concept of these two things and these two things make those four things. Based on his findings, Russell makes the declaration that universals give us knowledge of things that we can't know through experience. So, a priori knowledge, he says, is not static. We can, in fact, learn new knowledge from a priori arguments. That's Russell's comment. It is obvious that I disagree with Russell, but that's not the point of the exercise here, even though he really infuriates me a lot on this these particular issues. But the point is to know what Russell said, and so Russell does tell us that universals give us these knowledge of things that we can't know directly through experience. They give us new knowledge, even though traditional philosophy says that they cannot, that they do not. And our last chapter for today is chapter 11, which deals with our intuitive knowledge. There are a lot of things that we believe, that we feel, and it seems necessary that we should be able to justify our beliefs in some way. We have a need to back up our beliefs with reason. We need to be able to construct an argument. We need to be able to explain in some way why we believe what we believe. Now, many times, induction serves as the justification. As we saw before, I have this basic belief that the sun will rise tomorrow because it's always done so in the past. But Russell says there's another form of justification that we use, namely that of intuition. There is no direct evidence that can be given, yet I still feel certain in my beliefs, right? A lot of times people talk about intuition in one way or another, that I'm able to intuit or get these vibrations, I get these feelings. I just know that this is true. And some people make reference to such things. That's what intuition implies. I can't prove it, but I feel pretty certain in my beliefs. Now, he tells us that there are three types of intuitive knowledge. First, there are truths as truths of perception. Okay? So, for example, if I'm looking out and I see a red path, I'm relying on my vision, and I'm relying upon my mind to draw a link to what I'm looking at, and I accept what I'm seeing. So I'm looking out into the world, I see that red path that's in front of me, and I recognize, because of having, I guess he would say because of having these concepts or these ideas, I would say because of having this language, I recognize what a path is. I recognize the concept of red, and I draw a link between those two things. I accept what I'm seeing. Now, of course, intuition, like induction, could potentially be wrong. The person making the claim, for example, might be colorblind, and so the color that they describe may not be the color that everyone else would see. To an individual, the average individual looking up at the sky, they're going to say that the sky is blue. But to a colorblind person, the sky is purple. And they're going to see things differently. So maybe what they are linking, what they are connecting may not be the same, or what we would call the truth. So truths of perception are intuitive. Secondly, there are judgments of perception. So if I look at the red path and I say, this red path is circular, right? It goes around and around in a circle. It's round. Well, here, the judgment describes the properties of the relation of the truth of perception. It's talking about what that path is doing. And so, much like if we're talking about the yellow brick road of Oz, right? It starts at the beginning and it twirls round and round and round and round and round before it heads out towards the Emerald City. And so that sense of twirling, that circular, that roundness is going to come into play. But again, we experience that directly, and we talk about the relation of the roundness to the path. That's intuition. Sorry. And thirdly, there are judgments of memories. If we use recollections of the past, if we rely upon memory to justify our claims. But the central problem here is that the memory is notoriously fallacious. Memory can fail us for a lot of different reasons. The most common, obviously, is the passage of time. The further we are distant in time from a particular event, the harder it is for us to recall the specifics of that event. A lot of times, holes start to develop within our memory. And when that happens, it produces a problem because our mind doesn't like those gaps. And so the mind tries to fill in those gaps. It tries to make us, create a coherent theory or a coherent idea or story within our mind. But that story that we create may not be the entirety of the truth. Another problem with memory is the fact that, sometimes people believe that they've seen something that they haven't. And other times, individuals will try to manipulate them into believing that they saw something as opposed to another. So memory does have these very basic problems. Memory becomes fuzzy as time passes, like I said. And so you are further away from an event, and now you're trying to recall it. What exactly happened? Can you remember every detail? Well, maybe if it was a major traumatic event, you might, but most people, no. There's also the power of suggestion. Individuals try to influence you in some way. There was an instance that was given at one point where an individual was in court, and they were supposed to offer testimony as to whether or not this gun that was fired, did you see the smoke that was coming up from that gun after it was fired? Well, as it turned out, the lawyer knew that the gun that was fired didn't smoke, because it had a particular cartridge that didn't produce any smoke. But yet, this person was very sure, was very certain that they saw smoke after that gun was fired. And so that completely discounted the testimony of that person, because it showed that their memory was faulty. They were led to believe something that wasn't necessarily there. Russell uses the example that a lot of people came to firmly believe that George IV was at Waterloo, because many people told the story that he was. He, of course, wasn't, but it was told enough times that people came to believe it. They came to accept it. And so we can be led in our beliefs. We also have a lot of preconceived assumptions in beliefs. There's a lot that fits into our mind at any given time. And so we're going to carry those, we'll call them prejudices, with us, because we're predisposed to think in a particular way or to understand things in a particular way. And so we carry that with us. You know, a good example of this is when the archaeologist Yigal Yadin wanted to excavate the site of Masada in Israel. Yigal Yadin was a well-noted archaeologist. He knew what he was doing, but he went into that excavation with preconceived ideas, and everything that he did was intended to prove what he already believed, which means that he ended up misinterpreting, misreading data that came up that should have led him in one direction, but he chose to be led in another direction because he wanted to prove something. This happens a lot. And so we have what is going to be called the web of beliefs. The web of beliefs is all of the knowledge that we have, right? Everything that we've seen, everything we've read, everything we've experienced, everything we've heard, you know, all of this stuff goes into our mind, and it produces what we call this web of beliefs. And these beliefs that we possess are such that when a new belief comes along, it has to fit into what's already there. If it doesn't, then a lot of times, even if it is a truth, even if it is something that we should be accepting, we're less likely to accept it for the simple reason that it doesn't fit into our core set of beliefs. Now, if some view that doesn't fit into your core set of beliefs is persistent and there doesn't seem to be any way to move around it, then you may find yourself having to reevaluate what your beliefs are. You may end up trying to change the web. But that's something that we don't really like to do. We're more likely to hold on to that core set of ideas and beliefs, and this new thing, no matter how rational it might be, let's throw it away because it doesn't fit with what we already believe. So the point of this basically is that the memory itself is a form of intuition. It is something that, like induction, could potentially be wrong. It is something that's not very reliable most of the time. And so it is also questionable. So again, you have your three basic types of intuitive knowledge: the truth of perception, the judgments of perception, and the judgments of memory. And at this point, Russell says that the point is that there are degrees of certainty when it comes to intuition. A truth of perception has a much greater likelihood of certainty than a memory many years after the fact, right? And so we consider that what I'm looking at in front of my eyes, you know, that red path, for example, when I see it directly, I'm much more likely to believe it than remembering what that path looked like 40 years later. So we use intuition, but we need to remember that just like just like induction, that intuition can potentially be wrong, and that there are some forms of intuition that are going to be of greater value to us than there are of others. All right? And that's going to lead us into the topic of truth and falsehood, which we will pick up in the next video.